G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Unparliamentary. This is our new fortnightly show or webinar series where we're going to try and give you the scoop on what's happening in federal politics and policy with a special guest journalist every fortnight. And this week for our inaugural episode of Unparliamentary, we're joined by Paul Karp, Chief Political Correspondent with Guardian Australia, and my colleague Greg Jericho, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute and Centre for Future Work. Before we kind of get stuck in, I did want to acknowledge that we live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. I want to thank you all for coming along today. And I also just wanted to let you know that 2024 is the Australia Institute's 30th anniversary. We are celebrating 30 years of bringing new ideas into the Australian public policy debate and leading the public policy debate across the country. We're really excited to be bringing a whole range of exciting events and some very amazing special guest speakers to Australia. So please head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find out about all our upcoming events, including Yanis Varoufakis, who is visiting Australia in March alongside Anote Tong, the former president of Kiribati. We've got lots of webinar series. We've got our new book club series all happening this year as part of our 30-year celebration. So check that out at australiainstitute.org.au. If you haven't used Zoom before, although I'm sure you're all old hands at it now, you can type in questions for Paul and Greg in the Q&A box, and a reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And finally, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and you'll be able to find it on our website a little bit later today or tomorrow. So it has been a really big start to the political year. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese kicked things off with a National Press Club address a few weeks ago, where he announced some big changes to the stage 3 tax cuts ahead of the Dunkley by-election. You might have also seen last night's Four Corners on Coles and Woolies ripping off consumers and farmers, which follows the ACTU and Alan Fell's inquiry into price gouging, alongside a bunch of other inquiries into rising prices across Australia. Plus, the Prime Minister got engaged. Barnaby Joyce was filmed laying down on the street in Braddon in central Canberra. We've got immigration hitting the headlines again and all kinds of other stuff. Paul, it's been a pretty big start to the year in terms of federal politics. What do you think are some of the key issues that have really started the year for the Albanese government?
Yeah, well, you could tell they were going to hit the ground running because Anthony Albanese came back in the first week of January saying that there would be more cost of living relief, and they wouldn't raise expectations like that, mere weeks out from a by-election, unless they were going to deliver on that, and deliver on that a lot sooner than the May budget. And then he didn't disappoint. Then the following week, it was revealed that cost of living relief meant a huge change to the stage 3 tax cuts, redistributing it so that everyone earning under $147,000 got a more generous tax cut, but still keeping basically the same amount of money going out the door over 4 years. And I think that's really also lifted aspirations about what the rest of Albanese government term is going to look like. From the first year and a half, it looked like they were sort of just crossing off election commitments and doing the minimum. I think they were unfairly criticised as having a small target strategy. I don't think they were that small a target in 2022, but they were just spending the whole term crossing this and that off. And it wasn't until that moment that it was like, oh, okay, they are committed to doing things differently when they think they need to, and suddenly they look a lot more dynamic, and they're on the front foot responding to events. And we'll see if that tone continues for the rest of the year.
Yeah, and it was, as you say, Paul, a pretty big change, because for a long time the government had kind of been ruling out that they were going to do anything, and I think there was this idea that the price is too big for breaking an election promise. But ultimately, Greg, it was such an enormous package, and cost of living is still such a huge problem that in the end, the case was persuasive that that was the best way to deliver, I guess, cost of living relief to a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, for us, it was always, and this is why we'd always been pushing changes, is that we actually thought it was this rather joyful combination of good policy and good politics. The stage 3 as it was so badly designed that actually the government could actually make use of the massive envelope of money that was there, $21 billion, redistribute it. So basically everyone's still getting a good tax cut, even if you are on 200 grand, but you could give a lot more to lower middle income earners who clearly have been the ones who have been smashed by the cost of living. So it was good policy, but we always just thought really good politics. And I think as we all sort of knew they didn't end last year really well. There was a bit of oh God, this ticking off as Paul says. They had been doing good things, and certainly we'd been very positive about the stuff they'd done on industrial relations, but and a lot of the sort of there was no big thing that you could really hang everything off of, and just sort of ticking the boxes, getting the homework in on time wasn't enough. And certainly in January, we all started just hearing the noise. The noise was elevating that something's going on, something big. And you're right, Paul. They don't mention these things unless they're going to deliver. Otherwise, it just makes it worse for them. You can't overpromise
And underdeliver.
Yeah, and so as soon as they really started talking about it, it seemed like, well, you got to do something to stage 3. Otherwise, that was always going to be the first question. Why are you still sticking with stage 3? Why didn't you think about changing stage 3? And so, in a sense, actually, in reforming and making stage 3 better, kind of killed off that aspect. And what we saw very, very quickly was actually, once everyone looked at stage 3, including the Liberal Party, realised this is not a thing anyone wanted to defend.
Yeah. Paul, that brings me, I guess, all of that was happening in the context, obviously, of people really still struggling with cost of living and the government needing further interventions on that. Last year, we saw them kind of directly intervene for things like childcare and the cost of prescriptions, where they have kind of direct control over prices, because, of course, with inflation, the risk is, they're not wanting to put extra pressure on inflation. But that brings me to kind of prices overall. So last night's Four Corners was on Coles and Woolies, kind of ripping off a bunch of people. But there's a whole range of inquiries at the moment, isn't there, looking into prices on a whole different kind of range of fronts.
Yeah, so you have the review of the Grocery Code of Conduct, which they are indicating they're going to bolster to try and get suppliers of the supermarkets a fairer deal. They also are looking at giving the ACCC more powers in terms of price monitoring and also merger reforms. So yeah, they know that competition law is an important lever for trying to ensure consumers get fairer prices. Just on some of the other price things that you mentioned in the economy, I mean, the energy relief package that they offered towards the end of 2022, that had an effect on limiting wholesale coal and gas prices, and then there were rebates for households. They've suggested that might be rolled over again. That's something to look for later in the year. And, on childcare, they've increased childcare subsidies, but there hasn't been a lot on the price control side yet. You do have recommendations from the ACCC and the Productivity Commission sort of warning that you can't just increase subsidies without more control on prices. So that's going to be one that they're going to have to decide on before the next election. Should you be pumping more subsidies in without more price controls in childcare? So suddenly, something that was unheard of until very recently, when the sort of neoliberal consensus was still pretty much a lock, is now up for public debate in some of these important line items in households' budgets.
Yeah, because we have really seen, I guess, during the pandemic, I guess the idea of what government can do and how it can intervene in the economy really changed. And I think it was significant that it was under a Liberal government that we had a massive wage subsidy scheme, for example, something you would never think of a Liberal government doing in the past. And I think it really did give the public a better idea of, just how much government can intervene to kind of help people. And with such cost of living problems and such big problems with inflation and getting that under control, Reserve Bank in raising interest rates is such a blunt instrument that hurts so many people. I think it really makes sense that the case is really there for the government to contemplate things that, as you said, were anathema prior to that. If you're listening to us, I think we've got about 430 people on the line with us. Let us know how cost of living is impacting you in the chat. And if you've noticed prices going up, because it seems to be such a huge issue for so many people. Greg, the Australia Institute's done a lot of work looking at the impact of prices and really putting the focus on what companies are doing and how much companies are raising prices by. How much has that been important to shining a spotlight where it needs to be?
Yeah, I think, to have a bit of a humble brag, I think it has been pretty important, because when we last year and even in early sort of mid to late 2022, when we were saying, hey, how can it be inflation going up because of wages when wages are going up half the pace of inflation? That's kind of wrong. Let's have a look at what profits are doing. Let's have a look at the actual organisations who set the prices. We don't go into Coles and Woolies and haggle over prices. We go and pay what they are setting.
Yeah.
And we looked at it and we saw that actually, profits had gone up quite considerably. Jim Stanford suggested, we're talking around 70% of the over 3% inflation was due to profits. And we kind of put that out there and we were fairly harshly ridiculed, and people were saying, that's not how economics work. And we're like, well, actually, it seems to be working this way all around the world. We kind of don't believe that Australian companies are pure of heart and nice. And certainly we were not believing that organisations like Coles and Woolies were facing more competition than they were overseas. So we were really pushing it hard because that's what we saw in the data and in the figures. And clearly it's something that I think resonates with people, because we always know historically, and there is a bit of sexism to it, but women and those who do the shopping are actually much more attuned to inflation than people who, maybe don't do the shopping every day. And people will say, yes, it's clear that there's no competition here. It's clear that they're raising prices, and then all their profit figures come out and go, geez, they're doing really well.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why it's really resonating at the moment is, I always sort of look back to the mining boom when inflation was rising, interest rates were going, and everyone kind of knew, yeah, geez, there's a lot of money around. The mining companies are spending like crazy. People would know people were working fly in, fly out, and they're making a mozza. Everyone was feeling kind of well off. No one's feeling like that now. And so it's a case of, well, if it's not what we're spending, where is the pressures coming from? And I think, just the fact that Woolies and Coles, I think, have been, and other organisations like Qantas, kind of gone a bit, thought that they could get away with a bit more than they have, and now that people were shining the lights on them,
It's gone too far.
Yeah, and they're like, oh shit.
Yeah. So I thought it was really interesting the impact of the ACTU's inquiry when Alan Fels addressed the National Press Club, I think the week before last, and he's a former head of the Competition and Consumer Commission, the competition watchdog, kind of making the point that prices are up all over the shop. As Greg said, it's airfares, it's groceries, it's petrol, it's all over the shop. And I think it's really shone a spotlight, Paul, back on competition policy, and that the watchdog needs some more teeth to really take on these big companies with heaps of market power who are kind of ripping off consumers. It kind of seems to have been an area of policy that's fallen by the wayside in recent years, but there has been a big problem for a while. Do you think the government will move in this area?
Absolutely. I had David Littleproud, the Nationals leader, on our podcast in the middle of last year, and he was calling for, $10 million penalties for breaching the grocery code of conduct and forced divestiture. So basically, if the grocery duopoly breaks that code of conduct, then you could force them to sell their liquor chains, for example. And it was very interesting comments at the time, but it didn't really catch on in the broader political discourse. But he is now riding the government very hard to do something on that. Anthony Albanese has raised expectations that Emerson's review of the grocery code is going to make it mandatory and substantially bolster it. And it would be very hard for Peter Dutton and the coalition to stand in the way of that, given they've just waved through the tax cuts, so they know that wasn't a good idea to stand in the way of tax relief. So what person in their right mind would be siding with the grocery duopoly in an environment like this? And the Four Corners episode last night, there was a vox pop from one shopper who said, I spent $46 on ingredients for lasagna, and I already had half the ingredients.
Yeah.
I can remember a shop like that over summer where I'd got some coffee, some ground coffee, $20, some dog food, $12, and the ingredients for pork tacos, and suddenly it was a $100 shop. And it's just like, some people on social media were ridiculing me for I must be giving my dog too nice a food. But honestly, it gets to the point where everyone has had that bill shock experience, and it energizes them and creates this political momentum for change.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, not just about the economics of it, but the politics of it, because it feels like the anger in the community is really built up ahead of steam for government to intervene. That's going to drown out the usual voices from like the business lobbies, your BCAs and your ACCIs kind of saying, no, stay out of the market. It just works fine. And let us keep all of our profits. And that was one thing that I thought came through really strongly last night was, all those excuses from the Coles and Woolies CEOs just seem so weak and just crumbled under the slightest of interrogation. This idea that, our prices are high because all of our, our profits are high because all of our costs have gone up. Well, your profits should go down if your costs are up, not profits up and costs up. Like, that's not the way economics works. Am I getting that wrong, Greg?
Yeah, it was a weird argument that because Australia has higher transport costs, that's why we have fewer supermarket chains, and that's why they make more money.
That's why they're some of the most profitable.
It's also America's got some pretty big land to cover as well. I mean, I also think from the politics, I was just sort of thinking Albanese and a number of others who were around when really this was last a huge issue, and that was when the Rudd government came in. And I think they would be very mindful not to do things that seem to be just nothing, like the grocery watch thing, like the petrol watch. They're just not going to do, here's a website where you can find cheap items. I think they realise if you're going to wade into this, you're going up against some two big gorillas. You got to come with a bit of a stick and really show that you mean business. Otherwise, everyone's going to go, well, you just, this is just a joke. So I think the politics there, as Paul says, it's quite interesting because the Nationals, and we saw last night in the the National Farmers Federation, they hate Coles and Woolies. It's one of those rare opportunities where you can really get the Labor, the union side, and sort of the Nationals and the Farmers Federation all on the united against a common enemy. And, it's a bit like we saw last year, the political blowback when it seemed like Rudd was kind of, and the government, not Rudd, Albanese and the government seemed to be kind of on Qantas's side, picking sides with Qantas. And everyone's going, what are you doing? So I think they'd be pretty mindful not to be seen to, we're cozying up to Woolies and Coles, because that does not seem a political game.
No love lost there. You talked about you were chatting to David Littleproud last year. So I just want to keep us with the Nationals for a minute. Paul, on the weekend, one of your recent columns for Guardian looked at that issue of the kind of viral footage of Barnaby Joyce on the main street of Braddon laying on the ground, possibly after a few too many drinks. And this kind of did kick off a bit of a conversation around double standards in Parliament, how other people have been treated for similar behaviour in the past. And then we've seen some kind of additional behaviour from Perrin Davey that was questionable. But your column kind of pointed out, well, what's really the big issue there? I just wonder if you can, for people who haven't read it, talk to people about some of those issues that you talked about on Saturday, because I thought that was a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree that was embarrassing, and I don't disagree that we should expect high standards of parliamentarians. But I do think that the significance of that episode was sort of blown out of all proportion. Like, you know, if female MPs have a harsher standard of scrutiny on them than Barnaby Joyce, like, why is the way that we resolve that by going harder on Barnaby rather than being less sexist towards female MPs? And also, you know, the sort of faux concern for Barnaby amongst his own members of his own party, when often they were commenting in the media that was in a way that was unhelpful and trying to shuffle him out the door. I thought, well, it's obvious why he's stuck in, because he thinks they're just trying to get rid of him. But then I brought to look at, well, what else was happening in Parliament that week? Well, the government released the Richardson review into offshore detention about the mismanagement of contracts and the lack of probity checking the backgrounds of the contractors that were getting, you know, multi-million-dollar contracts, but were, you know, being investigated for serious criminal offences in other jurisdictions. It's just like, why are we worried about Barnaby because the video's funny, because being pissed is, you know, a sort of personal failing, when failures of systems, you know, are a lot more important. And you know, I thought the review itself didn't really make any effort to try and get to the bottom of it. You know, the reviewer saying, oh, it would take the wisdom of two Solomons to work out, you know, who was responsible for this. I just thought, well, that's what ministerial responsibility is.
Yeah. And can you, for people who aren't aware, Paul, can you just remind people what that Richardson review found? Because it was pretty bloody shocking, if you don't mind my swearing.
Yeah, let me just read you the lead to my contractors suspected of drug smuggling and weapons trafficking were handed multi-million-dollar contracts due to a lack of due diligence in the administration of Australia's offshore detention groups. So, you know, circumventing US sanctions against Iran, suspicious money movements, money laundering, bribery, and other criminal activity they were suspected of and being investigated of. It's just crazy that you know, as long as they get the job done in offshore detention, that these things weren't considered relevant to whether or not they get contracts.
And it wasn't even sort of, we're not just talking benefit of hindsight. I mean, even at the time, everyone was going, hang on, didn't this mob just have an office in Kangaroo Island or something? Yeah. And, you know, everyone's like, how'd they get this? So it's not like we're all just, oh, we're all wise now. There were questions being asked at the time, and what's come out now is just, oh God, it was worse than we thought it was.
Yeah.
And you're right. Where's you know, there used to be a thing called ministerial responsibility, and we seem to have just, you know, washed that away somewhere along the line. I don't know when the decision was made that ministers never resigned or are never accountable for anything. And this is just an incredible thing that.
Well, it seemed to me like the kind of thing that maybe the new National Anti-Corruption Commission would look into, but unfortunately, because it doesn't have public hearings necessarily every time, might be a little while before we find out if they're inquiring into something like this. But we've seen immigration come back into the headlines, Paul, because of boats arriving again. But I just thought this really shone a spotlight on how badly things have fallen down within that department, when, you know, we've all of a sudden got Peter Dutton, who on water matters could never be spoken about, and immigration was just this black box for the whole years of the coalition government, now demanding answers and transparency. Like, it's pretty big hypocrisy, and there's some serious issues for him to answer, you know, as the Home Affairs Minister during this time. Has he faced like, give us an idea of the kind of scrutiny that he has faced, or any answers that he's given on that so far?
Well, Peter Dutton is currently attacking the Albanese government for a reduction in surveillance flights. Surveillance flights that are delivered under a contract that was awarded by the former coalition government. This is the contractor that they chose, that's not able to meet the terms of the contract because of issues getting and issues with aircraft maintenance. It's not a decision that the Albanese government has made to cut flights, and claiming that they've cut $600 million from the program, when that is an extrapolation of 1 year that was over budget, extrapolated over 4 years, when that's not how you do this accounting. What you do is you look at the projected spending and look at what was projected in the last coalition budget, and it's actually gone up $470 million. So they're using these sort of accounting tricks to make it sound like Labor is slashing border protection when nothing's further from the truth. The policies are the same. They turn back boats at sea. If you make it to Australia, you get sent to offshore detention, and no one who arrives by boat after 2013 is allowed to permanently settle in Australia. The only difference in their policies is that Labor abolished temporary protection visas, which were only for people that arrived before that 2013 deadline. So there's no pull factor there in any reason to get on a boat in 2024 because of Labor's treatment of a legacy caseload from before 2013. So there really is no relevant difference between their policies. And Dutton, does he take any accountability for that? No, he just says, oh well, I would do it tougher, or they know I mean it when I do it, or it's just sort of the vibe of it.
Yeah. We're going to come to questions from the audience in just a second. I can see we've got about 470 people on the line with us. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. Greg is our Chief Economist and Chief Economist for the Centre for Future Work. And Paul Karp is Chief Political Correspondent for Guardian Australia. Thanks so much for joining us for Unparliamentary. You can upvote other people's questions if you can spot a good one in there, or stick your questions in the Q&A chat. Paul, we've got coming up another couple of sitting weeks and ASEAN coming down the pipeline. I just wonder, before we go to more questions from the audience, what are the things that we're anticipating coming down the line when Parliament resumes?
Well, there's still a lot of legislation to get through. There's a lot of wrangling over the PRR tax changes, which haven't got through Parliament. We've also got the ASIO risk assessment coming up, but I think that Labor will still try and get more credit for the tax cuts, using their Dixes to talk about cost of living relief in the lead up to the Dunkley by-election, which is at the end of that sitting week on the 2nd. So there'll be a big lead up to that. Peter Dutton framing it as asking people to cast a vote against the government because prices have gone up, and Anthony Albanese saying to go for them because they've actually done something in proposing a solution with the change of tax cuts. It'll be interesting to see whether the opposition continues the border attacks next week, or whether they shift to cost of living. I suspect they'll have to shift because of that by-election focusing the mind on the 2nd of March.
Yeah. Just before, so we do go to questions from the audience. Greg, PRRT, that's something you've been working on a lot in recent couple of weeks. So just tell us what the changes are at the moment and why the Australian Institute is proposing an increase in the PRRT.
Well, basically, the PRRT is
well, first of all, what is it?
Yeah, I was going to say,
it's
called the Petroleum Resources Rent Tax. It's notionally meant to be kind of a super profits tax on petroleum, on oil and gas. The problem is it hasn't really worked well once we've moved to the sort of the LNG side of gas. It was set up just for Bass Strait and all of those type of operations, and it really hasn't kept up with the changes. So one of the big problems with it is because it's a tax on sort of extra profits, the problem is companies can defray those profits with costs of setting up the operations, and their accountants are very good at doing this, to the point that some massive gas offshore fields and everything don't anticipate ever actually having to pay the PRT, because they'll be just able to keep saying, oh no, our cost was still always greater. So what the government is trying to do is, or they've proposed, amending the legislation so that companies can only defray up to 90% of their revenue in costs. And the government suggests that this will bring an extra $2.4 billion over 4 years in revenue, in tax revenue. The problem is, though, in their most recent budget figures, they actually wound down their estimates of how much PRT tax revenue would come in by 2.4 billion. So it seems like it's not that big of an increase. It might actually be nothing. And it's more about just sort of fiddling around the edges. And we've certainly been arguing in our submissions that you should look at maybe an 80% or a 60% cap. You could raise many more billions of dollars. And even what you should do is kind of realize what we should be worrying about is when gas companies and oil companies are able to make massive windfall profits because of, say, hypothetically, Vladimir Putin decides to invade Ukraine, just to throw an example out there. Those $40 billion in extra profits won't get captured by the PRT. And we're like, well, maybe we should just set almost a bar of what is a good return, and anything over that gets triggered. And so there's a lot of things to do. The government essentially was, there was a review into the system. There were 3 proposals. The government chose kind of the smallest one. And it hurts the gas companies so little that the very day that the government announced them in the budget, the gas peak body came out and said, yes, please pass this quickly. Be bipartisan on that, because I get the feeling that they don't want anyone to really have a look and realize that actually this is a very sweet deal. So Paul's right. There is a Senate inquiry into that at the moment. I think that's certainly something the Greens are very much on board in saying, hang on, there's a fair bit of revenue here that we're missing out on that could be used, especially for things like public housing and other things. And I know the crossbenchers are also in that. So it's not a slam dunk for the government to get through, especially because the Liberal Party are kind of opposing it because they want to seem like they are low taxing, even though the gas companies are saying, gee, shut up, just let through. So that certainly is a big fight that's probably going to come up in around April, I'd say. But so after, not a big thing for the Dunkley by-election, but certainly in the lead up to the budget.
So we'll go now to questions from the audience. The first one I've got is from Richard Tuffin, who asks, has the Liberal National Party's stop the boats mantra lost a bit of its zing, especially when the Prime Minister can counter with facts about how dysfunctional the previous immigration system administered by Peter Dutton was? How's the politics of that playing out at the moment, Paul? Because we know that's obviously been a very potent mantra in the past.
Sadly, I don't think it's lost its zing because I think that some sections of the media, there is a double standard in the way that these things are treated. I mean, Labor has mentioned that, that there were asylum seekers that were wandering around Queensland in 2018 under the coalition government, but I don't remember this sort of blanket coverage and, the News Corp megaphone being applied to the failings of the government then. So I do think it has some sting to it. You look at some of the dirty tactics, some of the negative ads being run in Dunkley, Advance Australia, the third-party campaign group, the right-wing get-up, they like to style themselves as. They are running ads that mention the 149 releases from immigration detention, which of course was required by a High Court decision and any government would have had to comply with, no matter who is in government. That's something that the coalition senior ministers, Peter Dutton and his shadow ministers, also amplify on their social media accounts, the criminal records of those people. So it is something that they are trying to get to take hold and to cost the government votes. It's yet to be seen if people can be, primed to, have such a, primed to vote on that as their main issue. Whether that's having any cut through, that remains to be seen. But actions of the media are certainly helping it along.
The next question is from Roger Tonkin, who says, was the rejection in response from a, well, I'm not quite sure what this is referring to. Rejection in response to a question from a Teal on the Garnaut-Simms proposal for a carbon solutions levy, premature and ill-considered. That must be the government, I guess. Yeah. Is it a proposal that eventually Labor will have to consider and implement in some form? So just for people who don't know, Rod Sims and Ross Garnaut addressed the National Press Club a few weeks back and proposed a carbon solutions levy that would generate about $100 billion in revenue. That's just how big of a fossil fuel exporter Australia is. I think we're number one, or we trade off with number one for coal exports with Indonesia. And I think we've overtaken Qatar as the biggest LNG exporter. We're the third largest exporter of fossil fuels behind Russia and Saudi Arabia. So they had a proposal that basically was looking at what a levy on fossil fuels as part of their presentation to the National Press Club. Paul, obviously Australia's had a huge number of political issues with pricing carbon in the past. But do you think there's more legs in that proposal, and then it's something that the government is going to have to return to in climate policy?
Well, I understand the way that levy would work would be both on fossil fuels domestically and also on exports. And I suppose the way the system works at the moment, where when you export fossil fuels and then they're burned overseas, they count on the other country's carbon account, not your carbon account, is something that means at the moment there is an incentive for us to just keep exporting fossil fuels because it doesn't count towards our targets. So I think this is a good solution. When there are negative externalities, when burning fossil fuels contributes to global heating, what you should do is you should try and reflect the price of that environmental damage in this case, by adding a levy to it. That is an economically rational thing to do, but politically very difficult because of the legacy of the interim carbon price under Julia Gillard. So what we are instead seeing is the Greens bidding Labor up through changes to the safeguard mechanism to try and make fossil fuel projects at the margins, less viable, and to try and impose higher environmental standards on them. So yes, I think it's a good policy. Do I think it will be adopted? No, because I think that we're already seeing in Labor resistance to some of those measures, like a climate trigger, for project approvals, that it's with great difficulty that they're increasing their ambition. I'm not sure they would go that far. Yeah.
Do you think the equation changes slightly, or that it will change in future? It just strikes me that we've had another summer, and they seem to be a regular feature now, of extreme weather events driven by climate change, more floods, more extreme weather events and storms and things like that happening all around the country. It's driving up insurance premiums for a start, but also we've just got so many people who are really directly experiencing the impacts of climate change. I wonder if over time that's going to kind of drive a shift in this conversation, because it's really obvious to a lot of people what the impacts of climate change are now. They're kind of directly experiencing it, whether it's through rising insurance premiums or because their house got flooded for the third time in 3 years. Greg, what do you reckon?
Well, I mean, one of the things about the Sims and Garnaut proposal is they were kind of pitching it as the European Union is going to start actually putting sort of, in a sense, tariffs on industries if they are not being subject to either carbon taxes, carbon prices, or an export levy. And they're saying, how about we get in before we're actually forced to do that? And their sort of a proposal was, in a sense, look, and wasn't to start this year. From memory, it was, I think, 2030. And so it was more a case of, look, we know this is coming down the hill. It's coming. Let's start preparing for it. And so I think that was a really good proposal, one that I agree with Paul. I don't think there's going to be much movement right now, and certainly not in the budget. But, if you want to differentiate yourself from the opposition and you want to, certainly we think about the tool seats, the government needs to be shown to be doing stuff on climate change and not, what it's done now. Okay, it's not going to get any more benefit from its 43% target. It's got to show that it's still moving, especially because we know emissions aren't coming down. So they're going to need to start doing something. Otherwise, they're going to start getting hit from the left or from climate change realists. And you're certainly right. I mean, I think things like insurance, people are realizing that insurance costs are rising because of one thing, that it's becoming really costly to insure houses that keep getting hit by floods, cyclones, and hailstorms and things. Heat waves, everything.
The next question I've got is from Heather De Cruz, and she says, or asks, how can we raise public awareness of the threat of an increase in expanded GST being proposed, like think tanks like the Grattan Institute, as a strand of tax reform, and that this seems to undercut better proposals for progressive taxes on large incomes and other things like that, with a lovely compliment for the Australia Institute at the end there. Thank you, Heather. But I guess really the stage 3 changes, I think, put the focus back on tax reform, and there was a lot of calls, Paul, for a wider tax reform debate. Allegra Spender was at the National Press Club kind of talking about everything should be on the table and trying to bring people into that conversation. A lot of that debate has been mired in, I think, some of the economic arguments from way back in the 80s. But it seems to me that that's not an area that the government will be able to keep ignoring. So we've already seen some movement on stage 3 that initially put the conversation back around things like, well, will they move on negative gearing and capital gains tax? But GST is one of those perennial things. Where is the tax reform debate headed, do you think, Paul?
Yeah, so I think the reason GST gets proposed is that we are quite reliant on income tax, and if you increase the GST, then you're taxing consumption more. I think a lot of people have come up with other things we should be taxing, like assets and land, which is quite an efficient thing to tax. Profits, oil and gas. But those are things that would also broaden the tax base away from just income, and they sort of get excluded from the conversation by vested interests. But in terms of the tax debate this year, I do think negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions will be the focus, because the Greens are demanding changes to those tax concessions in return for their vote for Labor's Help to Buy scheme, which is the shared equity scheme where the government would take 30 or 40% equity in your home, so you'll have smaller mortgage, smaller repayments. Now, this is going to be a big fight this year, because one of the biggest causes of inflation and things harming household budgets is increased rent. And so I think that it's a very politically potent debate, because the Greens are pitching themselves to try and be the party of renters, and Labor is still scared of having lost the 2019 election. They don't want to revisit these tax concessions, and they don't want to break another promise after they change their policy on stage 3 income tax cuts. So it's setting the stage for threats of a double dissolution again, like there were last year in the housing debate, and possibly the next election being fought particularly on the housing issue. So it is a difficult one, but I think that's where we'll get the most debate on tax reform this year.
Greg, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the problems for Labor is no one really understands anything to do with tax, so it really is easy, as we saw in the last election, to do fear campaigns that are completely divorced from reality. But I think, as we also saw with the stage 3, when there is a lack of understanding of it, there is the opportunity for them to frame the debate and frame any changes. Negative gearing, I think, is going to be tough because it just has it's such a phrase in our consciousness that people think they've got a fixed view on it. Whereas I've always sort of argued for you, say, oh, what about the capital gains discount? They'll be going, well, wait, what? What is the capital gain? What's the discount? Who's getting it? And I think there's room there for them to actually make some real reform, because what is the big nasty secret of Australia's housing policy is that it's actually the capital gains discount, where you get half of what the profit you make on selling your house, you get half of that tax free.
Yeah.
That's actually the thing that's a lot more dangerous to housing affordability than negative gearing, which has been around for ages and was always just a little minor thing.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
I think there's probably a long way to go in that, just simply because, as you said, Paul, the Greens are so focused on housing and making that into a real electoral winner for them. And I just think housing affordability is such a huge issue, whether you're paying higher mortgages because of interest rates or you're a renter whose rent has gone up. It's just a problem right across the board. So it just seems like something that's not going to go away very easily for the government.
I think it's also kind of a fight that the government likes having with the Greens, because it kind of marginalises the Liberal Party, because they're never seen as the party of lower house prices or lower rent or anything. They're always going to be seen as protecting the investors. So I think it really gives Labor the opportunity to say, oh, look at us, we're in the centre, we're thinking about the majority, and I don't think they mind that fight, but they got to come up with something.
Yeah.
The coalition has their own offering on this, which is to give first home buyers access to their superannuation.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a good idea, because it will inflate house prices and will benefit the people that already own houses. But we saw a lot of people access their super early during the pandemic and quite liked not having to wait, 3 or 4 decades for it. That could be a vote winner for Zoomers and millennials who feel like they're locked out and it's a long time before they're going to get that money. I think the way that they proposed that before the last election was, leaving it to the last week of the campaign, and it suffered from that. People said, well, if it was such a good idea, you would have done it while you're in government. But I think round 2, that might be more interesting to see whether that's a vote winner.
Yeah. The next question I've got is from Paul Loring, and he was asking about the Israel-Palestine war and talking about a new Jewish organization called the Jewish Council as a bit of breath of fresh air into that debate. But Paul, I actually wanted to ask you about this idea of doxing that the Albanese government had talked about in recent days, because it strikes me that is something that could trap journalists as much as ordinary Australians on social media. In the past, we've seen News Limited, for example, I think engage in conduct that seems remarkably similar to doxing to me. Do you think the government has thought this through, this legislation and the implications of it? And will it be a priority, or was it kind of a bit of a knee-jerk reaction as part of that debate?
Well, for many years, there have been calls to legislate against serious invasions of privacy, because you don't actually have a general right to privacy in Australian law. So they were going to give people some redress if there was a serious breach of privacy. But then that recommendation is now being considered in a new light in this very specific context of Jewish Australians being identified from a group chat of 600, sort of politically it gets variously characterized as supporting each other or as political organization, and so it's debatable whether a group that large is part of public discourse, or whether that's a private thing. But so far there's been very little detail about what this anti-doxing proposal is going to consist of. Dreyfus was asked what sort of details about people. He said, oh, well, any details. It could be a photo of their house. What the defining characteristic of it will be a malicious purpose, but that seems very hard to define. that there are going to have to be exceptions for public interest journalism, but then what about the person, the source providing the information to the news outlet? Is that going to be protected? So it's going to be very hard to square the circle on this one to protect against things that we generally agree are bad and not to overreach. We'll have to wait and see what the detail is, but my sort of spidey sense going into it is that it will be like defamation law, where it will be, you know, the powerful people who can afford lawyers who will benefit most from this law, and that, you know, the others not so much.
Yeah. The next question I've got, hang on, I'm going to go through. There's a question here from Jennifer Grant about what's happening with the EPBC Act reforms. Paul, you talked a little bit earlier about the concept of a climate trigger being introduced into various bits of legislation, I think, including the EPBC. Is there any word on when those potential reforms might be facing the Parliament?
Well, Tanya Plibersek is consulting on it at the moment, but this is something that the timetable has slipped on, and so they want to do it this term, but this is one that would not surprise me if they get beaten by the clock between now and the next election.
The next question is from John Carroll, who asks about, are either of the major parties really going to enforce stronger competition policy when they both receive political donations from big business? Kind of two elements to that question, Paul. One on donations reform, I guess, and transparency, and the other around going back to that idea around stronger competition policy is required. If we start with the donations element of it, is there a sense that government doesn't want to touch this, and probably neither does the opposition, because, you know, big business is politically powerful and donates to both sides of politics?
I think big business donate to both sides because it grants them access, but I don't think it necessarily grants them outcomes. So I don't think that you know, Coles and Woolies could chip another, you know, 100,000 in or million in and stop themselves being subjected to higher regulation. So you know, you mentioned the Qantas example previously, like why was the government allow this perception that it was too close to Qantas? Well, that was because they were in the middle of the referendum campaign and Qantas was helping them out there. So maybe it was a little harder to beat up on them. But no, I don't think a donation from Coles or Woolies is going to dissuade the, you know, higher competition standards. No.
Greg, any reflections?
Yeah, no, I agree with Paul. I think the thing that governments and political parties are more afraid of is big companies using their money in a marketing campaign against them. And I think they would quite welcome Woolies being seen as being so tough on Woolies and Coles, because I think it's a case of, yeah, they're going to argue that, oh, you know, look how many people we employ and everything. But I think there's also people who shop in these places and know what's going on. So I think if the government can get the messaging right, I think they will. And also just the fact that they, as we were saying before, they've got Craig Emerson already working on it. They're going down that path. They kind of have to deliver. And I think actually the political mood has certainly moved towards wanting something to deliver and not thinking, oh, well, I guess, you know, we just need to let the companies do what they will and they'll get the best outcome. Everyone's kind of twigging to the fact that there isn't much competition out there.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I think they certainly wouldn't be going, oh, hell, we'll lose $100,000 in donation. That's not, as Paul says, not that there's things that aren't wrong with donations, but we're not quite America, and also it's probably not enough money. We need millions of billions.
The next question that I've got is around the unclosed gap. So we saw the report back, Paul, on the closing the gap outcomes recently, and it wasn't good news, as it normally isn't. But on the heels of obviously the unsuccessful Voice campaign, what were the reflections and the responses in Parliament to that Close the Gap report and those poor outcomes?
Well, there's sort of a shift in the government's rhetoric from, the voice campaign and improved consultation to, concrete measures to close the gap. So they've reformed the CDP. I think it's the Commonwealth Development Program, which they say wasn't helping to close the gap in employment outcomes. Some of the indicators. Some of the indicators are moving in the right direction, but the majority aren't. And I think we are still waiting to see what more will be committed to try and close the gap.
And then lastly, I want to come back to tax. So Lynette Arden asks about the low and middle income tax concessions, or the Lamito, being gone. And so though there's been a change in stage 3, what will happen for retired people on a lower income? Are they worse off, Greg? And getting us back to that idea of what the government has to do on cost of living.
Yeah, the Lamito was a massive, the lower middle income tax offset was essentially a $1,500 tax increase for everyone when it was removed. And it was a bipartisan decision that everyone went to the election. Let's not talk about Lamito. Until it actually came to the point where it was no longer in place, and then suddenly Peter Dutton was acting like this was some Labor shock. To me, it seems like if you were going to do anything on tax, that would be an interesting way to go about it, because one of the good things with the lower middle income tax offset is you can kind of cap who benefits from it. Certainly low middle income or low income earners are still behind when you take into account the loss of the Lamito. But given that neither party is actually suggesting that it's going to come back, certainly the Liberal Party hasn't at this point, even though Peter Dutton used his budget reply to criticise it, he didn't actually say we'll bring it back. But I think that's one to park. I wouldn't be surprised if that does rise from the dead again. It's a good way of addressing sort of some tax reform where the government can say, hey, we've done the big stage 3 tax reform, but there's other things that we can do, and offsets are a good way to go about doing it.
So Paul, just to finish us out, give me a little very short summary of how you think the government has started the political year. Are they on the front foot, the back foot? How's it tracking for them?
Just wanted to add to one previous answer that the $700 million that was committed to closing the gap in replacing the community development program with other training measures and investments like justice reinvestment. So there has been some money committed to it, but I think we are still expecting more. So sorry, your question again was?
Just a bit of a summary of how the political year has started for the government.
Well, I think it's a huge win to have got the coalition to sign on to the changed policy on stage 3 tax cuts. I think the next thing that we're expecting is that there's going to have to be in the budget something big for climate. Anthony Albanese is now raising expectations of, a multi-billion-dollar investment as Australia's answer to the US Inflation Reduction Act. So that they do understand that to meet these incredibly ambitious, emissions reductions target in the electricity sector, they're going to have to get going on that. So I think it's been a very positive start to the year, but you can already see that there are going to be extremely big fights that are going to carry on into the next election. On the left flank on housing and the tax concessions. On the right flank, we're seeing scare campaigns on the car and ute tax, the fuel emission standards. Like you can see where the coalition are going to go, not just in the lead up to the Dunkley by-election on 2 March, but that is going to be scare campaigns that are going to be rolled out for the entire rest of the term. So a good start, but watch this space.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Paul Karp and Greg Jericho, for joining us. Thanks, everyone, for joining us online. This is our first episode of Unparliamentary. It's going to be a fortnightly show, and you can sign up for the rest of the year. Next fortnight, we'll be talking to Rachel Withers, the editor-in-chief of The Politics. But don't forget, you can head on over to Guardian Australia to check out all Paul's reporting and a couple of those really fantastic columns that we've discussed today. And we hope that we'll see you again next fortnight. And again, don't forget to head on over to australiainstitute.org.au for all our upcoming events and webinars. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today and for all of your questions. As usual, I'm sorry that we can't get to all of them, but hopefully we covered a nice variety there. And don't forget to check out our podcasts, the one that I host called Follow the Money, where we discuss big political and economic issues and put them in plain English, and Greg Jericho's podcast, which is called Dollars and Cents. And what are you be talking about in this week's episode, Greg?
Wages.
Wages, never going up enough, never going down enough if you're an employer. So don't forget to subscribe to those wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Thanks again for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you in a fortnight's time. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.